Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking you for giving up your Saturday. I know with the weather being so nice outside, it's really tempting to be out there, right? Especially since we've been freezing for so long. Well, I'm appreciative that you're here with me today. And I wanted to start off by just pointing out to you that this talk means a lot to me because it actually stems from hearing about these other dreams that began when students were younger. I grew up in my generation watching some Japanese anime. How many of you like Japanese anime? A few of you, okay. Well, there's one in particular that stuck out for me, and it was called The Eighth Man. And the primary character was named Tobor. And if you look at that backwards, it's robot. And so the whole premise behind this was of a person, of a police officer actually, who was badly injured and was given bionic parts. Does that theme sound familiar to you? It's been used over and over and over again many, many times. And it's an important one because it is becoming more and more reality as well. So when we start going through the ages and you go back to television shows like The $6 Million Man or more recently RoboCop, you start to ask yourself, how realistic are these types of technologies? And so what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit about what we've been doing in terms of trying to develop synthetic muscle. So before I begin, I really need to say thank you to several people. My collaborators, whom you see listed here, the students, without whom I really couldn't have done this work, and they really deserve all the credit. And then, of course, financial support, because this is our own creative research. So the part where I'd like to start is in something that we all share as a human community, and that is art. We have traditionally, since the days of the Greeks and the Romans, had a creative sense of the human machine. Whether you consider looking at the intellectual power up here, or you start looking at the separation processes that go on within the lungs, within the intestinal tract, those are really incredible processes that we often take for granted. But we try to mimic those, and they're incredibly difficult. But the one aspect that really draws attention, especially to artwork like the David here, is on physical form, physical prowess, if you will. How many of you like to go to the gym to work out? How many of you like to go to the gym to work out so you can look good? Okay, there's often that difference between wanting to go there for one purpose versus the purpose of just doing it for health's sake. And if you look at what has been accomplished in terms of physical prowess, whether it be incredible strength, being able to deadlift 1,000 pounds, I can't imagine that. But the record is actually over 1,000 pounds. Or having the agility to come down a ski slope in the Olympics and winning gold. That is, again, an amazing feat. And we often take our musculature for granted. But what about those who can't? What about those who have been born with deformities? They suffer, and they learn to cope with those handicaps. What about those who are forced with handicaps? What about the soldier who comes back from Afghanistan and is missing an arm or a leg? Are there any veterans here with us today? I'd like to thank you for everything you've done for us. People take for granted the fact that these young men and women have to change their entire lifestyle because of what they've endured. This is one aspect that drives this need for looking for synthetic muscle. The other one, a little bit different. Yes, it looks like a cockroach. You don't want to step on this one, it costs a couple $1 million. Okay? This little guy uses materials that are very similar to what I'm going to be telling you about today. Now, it's kind of fun to watch, but think about what you could use this for. What about sending in these types of small robots into a burning house to check for survivors or to check the caves of Afghanistan? Lots of possibilities here. And they don't all have to look like this six-legged cockroach. They could, of course, appear as snakes and reptate. Or they can fly, where we have micro-air vehicles. So there are lots of different possibilities here. Now, if you're starting to think about where would you start? Where does the journey actually begin when you're talking about developing artificial muscle? Well, you start thinking about what are the options. You want to start with a metal? Gee, I don't know about you, but having abs of steel taken literally, that sounds a wee bit uncomfortable. Okay? So you start thinking, well, maybe steel's not the way to go. Maybe metal's not the way to go. Ceramics. Oh yes, ceramics break easily. That would be impressive. So that kind of takes us to the realm of polymers, plastics, rubbery materials. And again, I don't know about you, but the idea of putting the equivalent of a Coke bottle into an artificial muscle doesn't sound all that appealing. So now we go to the other extreme of soft materials, and we talk about the rubber band. Okay? Now, just to put things in perspective, this is what we're trying to emulate. That's a hummingbird. Hummingbirds flap their wings anywhere from 12 to 80 beats per second. So this is a very, very quick muscle contraction and release. More importantly, think about how many times it has to be done. Okay? So we're looking for certain characteristics. Does the rubber band work? Well, I've got some here for you. Can't see you, but there. So the idea is if you started to play with your little rubber band, stretches. It does what you might think it should. Okay, it goes back and forth elastically. And you know rubber in other forms. I think most of you drive a vehicle, and so you do rely on tires. Question is, to begin with, how do we actually develop these rubbery materials, or actually more appropriately called elastomers? Well, if you've never seen where rubber comes from, it's called a biopolymer because it comes from a tree. These trees are located primarily in Southeast Asia, and just like when you collect maple syrup up in Canada, you collect rubber. Okay, it's actually, the technical name is polyisoprene. It wasn't until the 1800s when a fellow by the name of Goodyear, sound familiar? Said, okay, here are all these polymer chains, and they're really, really soft, and in fact, if you have pure natural rubber, it flows. In fact, when I was doing my graduate work, I had a big lump of natural rubber, and I judged the progress of my PhD by how far the polyisoprene flowed down a filing cabinet. So what Goodyear did was he cooked the stuff. He basically put this in an oven with a little bit of sulfur, and he found that he could start to develop these linkages between the chains. So now you have this really soft material, but it can't go anywhere. And so that gives it this elasticity. Now, there is one small problem when you're dealing with natural rubber, and it's the same problem that we now face with having all the waste from our cell phones. What do we do with it when it's finally used up, when it's exceeded its application lifetime? Does it go into a landfill? Or, like some tires, do we burn it? Okay? These are not acceptable alternatives anymore. So one thing that we could try to do is maybe say, well, let's try to replace these linkages which are covalent, which means they're permanent. Let's go ahead and make them temporary. But temporary in such a way that they will withstand the same kind of deformation that you would get from a simple rubber band. Well, that leads us to a very interesting characteristic, because we want these rubbery materials, we want these, what I'm going to now call physical crosslinks, to be materials that we can heat up, they can flow, and then we cool them back down and they become hard. They might become crystalline, they might become glassy. And the types of materials that actually incorporate these look like this. This is where we start getting into the nanotechnology. Because this type of a material, imagine that the red is a rubbery material and the blue over here is a glass-forming material. This guy behaves very much like a detergent, like your soap. Soap tends to self-assemble. It forms these really cool nanostructures that can be spherical or cylindrical or planar, or something even like this. Okay? This, by the way, these are not simulations, these are data. And to give you an idea of how big these are from one channel side to the other, about 20 nanometers. Okay, so you're getting an idea of how really exquisite these nanostructures can be that are formed by this kind of copolymer. Well, this isn't actually going to work for us, because while we have a glass-forming material and a rubbery material, we have no way of kind of anchoring them together. And so that actually now brings us to the main player that I'm going to talk about, which looks like this. And now these end blocks here are glassy. This guy in the middle is rubbery. And when this starts to form any of these, you get something that looks like this, where you could have the molecules forming loops or forming dangling ends, which are not really favorable. But this guy is really important. It forms a bridge. And imagine having a system where there are lots of these bridges. You form the same kind of network that you would get from chemical cross-linking. Well, for that reason, these materials are called thermoplastic elastomers. And you could think of these as physically cross-linked rubber. Unlike natural rubber that's chemically cross-linked, you can now take this material, heat it up, it flows. You can reuse it. You can recycle it. Okay, very important aspect. If we want to make it soft, a rubber band is still kind of hard compared to your skin, or compared to muscle more explicitly. If we wanted to make it a little bit softer, we could go ahead and add in a little bit of an oil. And if I could have someone to pass out the samples, please. See, this is the time when you actually want to sit in the front, because I've got some samples of these that you can play with. And they're completely safe, but please don't eat them. But you can start stretching these as much as you want. These guys actually stretch more than rubber bands, and they don't break. Well, at least they didn't break when I tried them. Okay? This is the regime down here where these nanostructures that we form aren't really useful, but we add in a little bit more of the copolymer, and we start to produce this network. And this network is what gives these materials all the right properties. So what are the right properties we're looking for? Well, here's what those little nanostructures look like. This is a transmission electron microscopy image. This is what is here. These are the actual data. And this is what you don't see. You don't see all these bridges that are connecting these glassy micelles. And we could actually get some very good order out of these materials. These are just tilt images showing you what these micelles look like. And just to put things in perspective for you, this is a human hair. Okay, if you look really carefully in there, there's a little nanowire. That nanowire is about 50 nanometers across. Okay, so it's 1/1000th of the size of a hair. These little micelles that you see here, as they're called, are about half that size. So 2/1000th of a hair. And to give you an idea of how easy these are to be strained and recovered, these are just stress strain curves that show if you keep repeating this kind of motion with them, you wind up not seeing a whole lot of deformation. Could you imagine what would happen if you started flexing your muscles and your muscles started to sag? That's not a pretty picture, folks. Okay, so in terms of what causes muscles to contract, it's electricity, right? And so we can actually produce materials that respond to electricity to get work. We can also get energy from these materials, whether it be by putting them in the soles of shoes, so you stomp on them and you're actually producing electricity as you're walking along, or maybe you're moving your arms, you're producing electricity, or on a larger scale, you can think about having buoy farms, and you could generate electricity from waves. The idea behind it is that these materials, when you apply a field across them, they expand, as you see here. And we can quantify this in terms of strain versus electric field. And if we look at the big landscape picture, these are the synthetic muscle analogs right here. And this is a jellyfish, in case you didn't recognize it. That's what these materials actually behave like in some cases. And this is where human muscle is. On the other hand, if you're looking for strength, well, you might not be producing Tobor or the $6 Million Man or RoboCop, because oftentimes those types of systems use shaped memory alloys or pneumatics or hydraulics. Those are strong. Okay? Our materials are down here. But so is muscle. That's what the red stands for. So we have materials that actually behave electromechanically like synthetic muscle. We can even use the same idea to get different motion out of these materials, where we introduce a hydrophilic, that is a polar block within the material. By adding in salts, we can cause the material to, instead of expanding out, Now this guy likes to wave at you. And if I let it go, it will continue all the way back by itself. We're doing nothing but applying electricity to it. So in conclusion, this is an idea that we proposed, and it's a promising one. We hope to be able to help those in need who have issues with prosthetics. Maybe we can help a person who lost a hand to play the piano again. On the other hand, maybe we can also help emergency responders not have to risk their lives anymore. And who knows, maybe we'll even help this dynamic duo. Thank you very much.